Just after midnight on May 1st, 1971, a 20-year-old woman named Elizabeth Ford was sleeping on a couch in the front room of a small house near a city in Arkansas called Texarkana. Elizabeth and her husband Bobby were staying at the house with Bobby's brother and his wife, who owned the house. Bobby and his brother were still both awake, and Elizabeth could hear them talking in the kitchen quietly. The house was surrounded by woods and swampland, and Elizabeth had opened up a window above the couch so a breeze was blowing in. Now, usually, she slept really well with the sound of the woods in the background, but tonight she was tossing and turning. And this was because, as she lay there trying to sleep, she became very aware of a unique sound coming from outside that was not the sound of, the trees blowing in the wind or the insects buzzing. This was something else. It was a slow creaking sound, and at first, it kind of sounded like it could be out in the woods somewhere. But eventually, Elizabeth realized this creaking sound was sort of moving back and forth, right outside on the porch, below the open window. Suddenly, Elizabeth's eyes flew open and she looked at the window because this creaking sound had just intensified and then came to a stop on the immediate other side of this window, like there was something heavy right outside. Elizabeth sat up to face the window, but she didn't see anything outside through the screen. And so right away, she felt totally relieved. She didn't know what that sound was, but clearly there was nothing there. However, just to be certain, she decided she would go a little bit closer to the screen and actually look right up close to make sure there was nothing down below on the porch. And so Elizabeth leaned forward and pressed her face to the screen and began to look. And as she did, this dark figure down below suddenly rose up and completely blocked out the window. And Elizabeth's looking at it, having no idea what it is. And before she could do anything, this huge thing slashed at the screen, and this big reddish furry brown paw with razor-sharp claws cut through the screen and nearly cut Elizabeth's face. Elizabeth screamed and practically fell over, and this dark creature outside turned and bolted and disappeared. And then a moment later, Elizabeth's husband Bobby and his brother came running into the room asking what was going on. Elizabeth was so shocked at what she had just experienced that all she could say to her husband was, "It's a bear! It's a bear!" Bobby helped Elizabeth off the couch and then told her and his brother's wife to stay in the house and away from the windows. And then Bobby and his brother got shotguns and flashlights and went outside. Once outside, Bobby and his brother began scanning all around the porch area where Elizabeth had apparently seen this bear to see where it was. They held their flashlights out and they scanned the tree lines. They looked all over the place, all around the front of the property, but there was no sign of this animal. And so the brothers looked at each other and nodded, and then they both left the porch and went different directions, kind of looping around the back of the house. They were going to scan the entire property and meet up at the back. And when they met up at the back, they still hadn't found this bear, and so they walked away from the house towards the tree line and did another big sweep together of the entire perimeter, again, looking for any sign of this animal. But there was nothing. And so after a while of circling the property, the brothers decided that, this bear must have just run off. And so Bobby and his brother returned to the porch to figure out their next move. Both Bobby and his brother were hunters, and they knew that usually the best thing to do with the bears that roamed this area was to leave them alone. These bears could grow to be 500 pounds, and if they were provoked, they could run at 35 miles an hour. And so generally, you just stayed away from these things, and they'd leave you alone too. However, as the brothers were sitting there talking through what had happened that night, they both said, it definitely seemed like this bear was different. Apparently it was aggressive enough to come right up to the house unprovoked and reach in and swipe at Elizabeth, which obviously was not normal bear behavior. And so to Bobby and his brother, this meant that they really couldn't just leave this bear alone. They had to go out there and find it and kill it to protect themselves. And so Bobby lit a cigarette to calm his nerves, and then the two brothers came up with a plan for how they were going to go find this bear. Bobby's brother would man the front of the house, and Bobby would man the back of the house, and they would stay in their respective positions monitoring the property until either they saw the bear and dealt with it, or until the sun came up, at which point they could go get help. And so after agreeing to this plan, Bobby took one final drag on his cigarette, chucked it to the ground, and then with his shotgun in one hand and his flashlight in the other, he stepped off the porch and walked around to the back of the house and stared off into the darkness. Bobby had only been in the back of the house for a couple of minutes manning his post when he began to smell this horrible smell. Now, at first he thought it was just some sort of wet, musky smell that came over from the swampland nearby, but as he continued to smell it, it got heavier and more pungent. It smelled like a wet, decaying animal. Bobby tensed up and aimed his flashlight up at the tree line and began looking back and forth, trying to figure out where this horrible smell was coming from. And as he was doing this, he suddenly heard the sound of tree branches snapping off to his left. And so he whipped his flashlight over and shined it, and he saw this big, dark figure charging across the property away from him into the forest. Bobby instinctively raised his shotgun and fired, and then after shooting, a loud yelp echoed in the air, and then Bobby just took off running in the direction he had just fired. And as he's running across the yard, he's screaming for his brother, who had already heard the shotgun blast, so he was coming around the house, and the two men linked up, and as they're running in the direction of this bear, Bobby's telling his brother, "I think I got it, I shot the bear." But they get over to where Bobby had last seen it and where he heard this yelp come from, and there was nothing. There was no bear. Still, the brothers did feel a little relieved. They figured even if they couldn't find this thing, clearly Bobby had hit it. He had heard the sound of it yelping out, and so maybe by at least wounding it, it would stay away and leave them alone. But just then, the men heard the sound of their wives screaming from inside the house. The men immediately ran back to the house, and as they got closer, Bobby again began to smell that horrible smell. And right as Bobby's foot hit that first porch step, his brother from behind him screamed out, "Stop!" But it was too late. The bear was on the porch. That's why the women were screaming. They had seen it, and Bobby's brother had seen it, but Bobby hadn't. And now he was too close to it to get away. And before Bobby could raise his gun to protect himself, this thing attacked. And Bobby felt this horrible burning, tearing sensation in his arm. He fell to the ground, twisting wildly back and forth, trying to protect himself. He was pinned underneath this enormous bear, level with its chest, with its arms and legs on either side of him. And that horrible smell he was smelling was clearly coming from this animal. That's all he could smell from underneath. But just then, it was like a miracle, because to his side, Bobby could see there was an opening, and so he rolled and somehow got out from underneath this enormous creature. Bobby scrambled up to his feet, and he darted past the bear and rammed into the closed front door of the house. It popped open, he fell inside, and his wife ran forward and shut the door behind him, leaving Bobby's brother outside on the porch alone with the bear. But before any of them could do anything about that, they heard the sound of his brother's shotgun going off. Then there was a long moment of silence. Inside the house, everybody was frozen. A few seconds later, the door slowly opened and Bobby's brother walked inside. Everyone was too shocked to say anything, so for a second they all just stared at each other, and then finally Bobby asked him, "Is the bear dead?" And Bobby's brother, with a trembling voice, said no. And that wasn't a bear. As soon as dawn broke and it was not dark outside anymore, Bobby's wife drove him to the hospital where they would treat him for shock and for the wound to his shoulder. They had hoped to find it somewhere on the property, either dead or wounded, based on Bobby's brother's account of having fired at it basically point blank, but the creature was gone. They did find its tracks though, and this discovery made it clear that Bobby's brother was right, that this wasn't a bear. Because in the dirt surrounding the house were all these bizarre footprints and handprints of a creature that seemed to walk on its hind legs with 3 toes on each and had 3 long sharp claws on its hands. And as unbelievable as this all seemed to the police, this actually tracked with what Bobby's brother said he saw when he was out on the porch. He said he saw a creature with reddish brown hair all over it that stood over 7 feet tall, and after being shot, it took off running on 2 legs, and it ran fast. But the most terrifying thing about it, at least according to Bobby's brother, was actually its eyes. They were blazing red. And when the news of this attack spread to the nearest town, which was called Fouke, the people there knew exactly what this creature was. For 200 years, people in that part of Arkansas had been talking about this huge creature that was sort of like a Sasquatch that roamed the forest and the swamps. They said it was fast and elusive, and it ate livestock and pets. They called it the Fouke Monster, or sometimes the Boggy Creek Monster. But Bobby Ford and his family's encounter with this creature was unlike any other story that had been told about the Fouke Monster. While some people claimed in the past that this creature had attacked people, nobody had ever heard of it actually coming up to somebody's house, trying to break in and terrorize a family. Bobby's ordeal would inspire the 1972 horror movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek. Over the years, police officers and some scientists have suggested that maybe what Bobby and his brother encountered that night was actually a feral pig. However, authorities have never actually been able to pinpoint what this thing was. Nobody knows. And to this day, hikers and hunters near the swamps of southwest Arkansas and also across the border into East Texas still report run-ins with the legendary Fouke monster. Me and the whole team at Mrballen Studios have created a special thank you to all you amazing fans for all your support. Now, you may have already heard about this, but if you haven't, my very first book, Mrballen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, finally comes out this year on October 1st. But that's not the thank you. The thank you is, for anyone who pre-orders this book, which includes 9 feature-length, amazingly illustrated stories, you will immediately gain access to a secret 10th story that's not in this book. This secret story is called A Forest So Evil, and it's really good. So here's how you get it. After you pre-order your book, whether you've already done that or you do it now, you're going to get a confirmation code. Go to the link we provided below and enter that confirmation code into the text box, but be sure you select the appropriate vendor beforehand where you pre-ordered it from, and boom, you will immediately gain access to this secret 10th story. I am truly touched at all the support you've shown me over the years, and so I really hope you enjoy this bonus story as a big thank you. Again, pre-order your copy today, and then head to the link in the description, enter your confirmation code to get that bonus 10th story called A Forest So Evil. On the evening of August 1st, 2015, a 20-year-old man named Mrballen walked alone down a main road toward his village in the South African province of Limpopo. Fraser was on his way home from work, and he was pretty desperate to get there. It was only about 7:30 p.m., and usually around this time, Fraser was used to seeing other people out and about on this road, just kind of walking around in the dusk or, chatting or doing various errands, but tonight there was nobody out there. And in fact, in recent days, this area of Limpopo had basically become a ghost town. Nobody went out unless they absolutely had to, because over the last 10 days, over 20 people in this area had been brutally mauled. The victims had all insisted that the creature that had mauled them was some kind of 4-legged demon, and they had begun calling it the Beast. Now, Fraser considered himself a pretty level-headed person who did not necessarily buy into the hype around this beast. He figured it was very likely just a dog. But still, he didn't want to get attacked, and so as he walked down this vacant road, he periodically looked over his shoulder just to make sure no dog was following him. As Fraser continued to walk along, he looked up and saw the huge forest fire that was raging on a mountain miles and miles off in the distance. A few days ago, the fire had started, and from Fraser's perspective, it still seemed to be going strong. In fact, in the darkness, it almost looked like the mountain was glowing red. Just then, Fraser noticed the turnoff for the shortcut that would take him through some forest back to his home, and when he got there, he stopped and looked over his shoulder one more time to make sure he was still all alone, and he was, and then he stepped off the main road, into the woods, and into the darkness. Under the tree canopy, the night suddenly seemed a lot darker. Fraser did his best to think about the chores he needed to do for his mother once he got home, instead of thinking about the beast. But he'd only been on this path for about 300 feet when he suddenly heard a rustling from behind him. And so right away, Fraser stopped and turned around and looked where the noise was coming from. But all he saw was darkness. There was nothing there. And so Fraser, for a whole minute, just stood there staring out into the tree line, waiting for something to move. But nothing did. And so Fraser told himself he was just being paranoid. Everything was fine. And then he turned back around and kept on walking. But pretty quickly, his walk turned into a jog. And he was almost to the end of this path, almost out of the forest. He could see his village. It was right there. When he heard noises behind him again. Except now, in addition to the rustling sounds, he heard a new sound. It was like a wheezing sound, like a sick animal that was breathing heavily. Now, Fraser knew he was not just being paranoid. Something was out there, and it seemed like it might be following him. Without slowing down, Fraser looked over his shoulder again to see what was out there, but again, he just saw nothing. It was just shadows. However, when he turned back around and kept on going towards his village, he heard this loud crashing sound behind him, like a massive animal had leapt out of the brush and landed on the path behind him. And so Fraser was immediately so scared he couldn't even turn around. He just started sprinting toward the village, and all he could hear behind him were these loud, pounding footsteps as whatever this was gaining on him. And so Fraser was so instantly terrified that instinctively he just started sprinting off without even looking behind him. And so as he's running, this thing's gaining on him, and again he can hear this awful wheezing sound coming from whatever this is, as if there was something wrong with its lungs. And in Fraser's panic, as he's sprinting through the forest, Fraser's telling himself it's just gotta be a rabid dog, that's why it's making those sounds. But he knew that didn't track. This thing is huge. This can't just be a rabid dog. And so Fraser just kept on running, and finally he got out of the trees, back into his village, and at the exact same moment, the pounding footsteps behind him came to a stop. But again, Fraser, he didn't turn around. He's too scared. He just ran for his door. His house was right there in front of him, and he gets to his door. He's about to open it up, and right as he does, he feels this searing pain in his neck. This creature, whatever it was, had leapt and grabbed onto him and bit down on the back of his neck. And so Fraser crumpled to the ground and threw his arms up over his head to protect himself, and with one eye, he can see it's this massive black creature on top of him, chewing on the lower half of his face. And so Fraser, he couldn't even feel any pain. He just began screaming for help, and he tried to push it off of him, but he couldn't. And then a second later, a flash of metal came across his eye as his mother and other villagers who had seen this happening and heard him screaming came out and began smashing whatever this was with shovels. And so a second later, Fraser's pulled away and dragged towards his house, and this huge black creature, it marched over to the edge of the tree line and just stopped, turned, and looked back at Fraser and his mother and the neighbors. And Fraser, as he's sitting there in total shock, he can tell that whatever this thing is, this enormous dog-like creature, this had to be the beast. That's what just attacked him. And in this moment, Fraser realized, this creature may have the shape of a dog, but it was not a dog. South Africa has its share of wild dogs, jackals, and hyenas, and typically they're multicolored and fairly small. And this thing was jet black, pitch black, and gigantic. And when this thing first started chasing Fraser, he'd had that panicked thought that maybe it was a rabid dog. But rabid animals are typically lethargic and confused. And this thing that was 15 feet away from them was absolutely alert and calm. The only thing sick about it was that horrible wheezing sound it would make as it breathed. And as Fraser and his mother and the neighbors just stood there staring at this thing, this creature just continued to stare back at them with piercing eyes. And its eyes were not normal. These were not like animal eyes or dog eyes. They were too small and set at the wrong angle. And there was real sentience behind them. They were human eyes. Just then, Fraser's mother grabbed Fraser and yanked him, kind of jerking him back to reality, and he scrambled to his feet, and he and his mother and the two neighbors, they took off running back into their respective homes. All the while, this creature just sat there on the edge of the forest, staring still in the direction of Fraser and his home. Once inside of Fraser's house, his mother immediately dialed the emergency number to tell the police about what had just happened, but the police told her they were not going to send people out there to deal with some dog. And so Fraser's mother decided she would just treat her son's wounds on her own until this dog-like creature had left, and then once it had, she would get him a ride to the hospital. However, as Fraser and his mother stared out the window at this creature, it didn't leave. It just sat there staring back at Fraser and his mother with these hideous human eyes for hours and hours. Finally, in the morning, it was gone. The attack on Fraser was the last straw for the people of his village. They believed the creature that had bit his face was the demon beast that had hurt so many other people. And so the elders of Fraser's village came up with a plan of how to deal with this beast. And so a few days after the attack on Fraser, this group of elders went off on a journey up into that mountain that Fraser had seen off in the distance that had that huge forest fire on it. And they were there for 2 whole days before returning to the village and telling everyone that they had successfully performed a ritual that had appeased their ancestors, and so hopefully now the attacks would stop. And sure enough, they did. They did not see the beast again. At least 40 people in Limpopo had encountered the beast at some point, either because they were attacked or they helped fend it off, like the neighbors did with Fraser. But because this beast was never caught, and it did stop attacking the village and just kind of disappeared, nobody ever actually figured out what it was. To this day, people in Fraser's village maintain that this creature was a demon and that it came down from the burning mountain, because every person, including Fraser, who had encountered this beast, noted its wheezing, heavy breathing, as if its lungs had been damaged by smoke. In all, at least 40 people in Limpopo encountered this beast, either because they were attacked or they helped fend it off. But because it was never caught, there is no definitive proof of what it actually was. In August of 1931, an 86-year-old man carrying a massive backpack limped into a supply store in the tiny town of Alvin, British Columbia, Canada. This man's name was Robert Brown, but everyone knew him as Volcanic, because decades earlier he had discovered a gold mine in Volcanic City, Canada. Volcanic had actually made his living as a gold prospector, and he had been so good at it that he had been able to retire early. And so these days, as an 86-year-old man, he pretty much got to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. And so inside of this supply store, the young man at the cash register smiled at Volcanic and offered to let him keep his backpack at the front of the store while Volcanic shopped. And Volcanic kind of scowled back at him. I mean, he took offense to this. He knew how he must look to this clerk. I mean, Volcanic was old, short, super skinny, and he dragged his left foot when he walked. And so he figured, this kid must think he's weak. And Volcanic hated that. He did not think he was weak. And so he said to the guy, "No, I can carry my bag myself, thank you very much." Then, to show the clerk there was more to him than met the eye, Volcanic flashed this big grin, revealing this gaudy, enormous set of gold teeth that he had bought when he had struck it rich in Volcanic City. And after seeing these ridiculous gold teeth, the clerk looked very taken aback, which was exactly what Volcanic wanted. Satisfied, Volcanic limped past the cash register and the clerk towards the back of the store, where he picked up some cooking supplies, ammo for his shotgun, and a pen to write in his journal. And then he took everything up front to check out. Volcanic watched as the clerk furrowed his brow as he rang up the items, clearly trying to make sense of what Volcanic was up to. He asked Volcanic if he was going camping by the Pit River that ran through town. But Volcanic said no, he was going to the Pit River first, but he was going to hike all the way along the Pit River, go through the mountains to another body of water called Stave Lake. And before the clerk could ask any questions, Volcanic said he was going there because there was a hidden gold mine he was going to explore. And at this, Volcanic watched with delight as the clerk's eyes got wide. Volcanic knew most people, especially in this area, thought this gold mine was a total myth. And sure enough, when the clerk recovered from his surprise, he said to Volcanic, hey, you really ought to reconsider going there. The clerk said he had seen plenty of people come through his shop on the way out to go try to find this mine, but nobody ever came back saying they had found it. In fact, he said that some of these people didn't come back at all. At least 2 people had died because the hike to Stave Lake was miles and miles through extremely dangerous terrain. Volcanic waited until the clerk was done lecturing him, and then he leaned over the counter and he whispered to the kid that he was different. He had a secret that would allow him and only him to find that mine successfully. And when he did, he would come back to the store and he would lay the gold down right on the counter just to prove it to him. Then Volcanic left a handful of cash on the counter, he gathered up his supplies, flashed one more gold-toothed smile, and then made his way out the door. A few hours later, Volcanic hiked uphill along the rocky banks of the Pit River. He'd only covered about 5 miles so far, because after all, he was 86 with a bum left foot, and so he moved pretty slowly these days. But even still, only 5 miles into the journey, he already felt totally cut off from civilization. The Pit River was about 1,000 feet across, and it was surrounded on either side by a thick forest. Volcanic was hiking parallel with the river, with the water on his right and the trees on his left. It was a stark and isolated setting that would make most people feel small and vulnerable. But after so many years working as a gold prospector, Volcanic was very accustomed to being out in the wilderness all by himself, so this felt normal. Now, of course, decades had passed since the last time Volcanic was a gold prospector, but even now, at his old age, he still felt like he was the skilled outdoorsman he once was. Volcanic kept on hiking uphill, staying close to the shore's edge, until the sun began to set. And by that point, the trees on the left had begun to thin out, and Volcanic was finally able to see kind of far out beyond in the direction he was going. And he saw off in the distance there were all these mountains. And as soon as he could see these mountains, he pulled out his journal, and he flipped to the last page, and he studied the page, and then looked at the mountains, and he smiled. It was going to take weeks to reach the gold mine, but he knew he was going the right way. Because on that last page of his journal was a map. This map was the secret that Volcanic had told the store clerk about. It was the thing that was going to allow Volcanic to reach that gold mine where so many others had not. Volcanic had actually drawn the map himself several years ago. Back then, he'd been panning for gold in northern British Columbia when he had run into this indigenous woman in the forest. And this woman was deathly ill, and so out of the kindness of his heart, Volcanic had given this woman some healing herbs and then stayed with her for days until she was nursed back to health. And this woman had been so grateful to Volcanic that she had told him a secret. She told him that the legendary gold mine out near Stave Lake was absolutely real. And she said she knew this because her father was friends with the guy who discovered it. The man's name was Slumac. And she said he would go into the wilderness for days at a time, and then when he came back home, he'd come bearing these huge gold nuggets as big as chicken eggs. And not only did this woman tell Volcanic about this mine, she gave him directions to it. And so as she did, Volcanic took notes in his journal and then used those directions to construct the map. However, before Volcanic parted ways with this woman, she gave him a warning. Right before he died, she said Slumac put a curse on the mine. And so now, if anybody tried to reach the mine, the forest itself would stop them. Before I became a professional, strange, dark, and mysterious storyteller, I served in the military. And during my time in the military, I had some pretty wild experiences. But what I remember most about my time in service was not my own stories, but rather the stories I heard from other service members. Keep in mind, service members are sent to some of the most isolated and treacherous places in the world that very few people go to. And so some of the stories that come out of those places are totally creepy and weird. And even more than that, a lot of these stories sort of stay in-house. They stay in the military just because it's kind of a cultural thing. You know, people don't necessarily want to go out and tell the world about the totally unsettling and inexplicable thing they saw while they were deployed. It's like people might think they were crazy. But there's lots of stories like that. And so if hearing some of those crazy military stories appeals to you, well, boy, do I have a podcast. And so now, standing in a clearing beside the Pit River, Volcanic thought back to that warning. He wasn't afraid of what she said, but just to be safe, he figured he would spend as little time as possible in the forest, and any time he needed to pitch his tent along this journey to the mine, he would do so as far away from the tree line as he could. This was actually Volcanic's second attempt at trying to reach this gold mine. 5 years earlier, he had attempted this exact same hike. On that attempt, despite Volcanic reaching the shores of Stave Lake, which apparently was right near the entrance to this gold mine, he had to stop because he got a severe case of frostbite on his left foot. That frostbite had caused 3 of his toes to die and rot, and so Volcanic had to amputate all 3 of them with his pocket knife right there out in the wild. No anesthetic, nothing. And so this is why Volcanic had to turn around on that attempt, and it's why he now walked with a limp. And Volcanic had to admit that the fact that he had been forced to literally cut off his own toes did make it seem like he had become a victim of Slumac's curse. But he also knew that it didn't take a curse to make the Canadian wilderness dangerous. He just should have worn thicker socks. Just then, Volcanic heard a twig snap somewhere outside of his campsite in the darkness. And so instinctively he shot up, he grabbed a shotgun, and he turned towards the sound, half expecting a bear to come charging out of the woods. But after standing there for several minutes, nothing came out of the forest, and eventually all Volcanic could hear was the gentle sound of his fire and the river. The forest was totally still. As his heartbeat slowed down, Volcanic told himself that, the sound he heard must have just been a rabbit running through the forest, nothing to worry about. And so he lowered his gun and steadied his breathing, and he looked at his fire and he gave half a thought to just leaving his campfire burning, just in case he heard something else, he'd have some light to go out and see what it was. But he thought he was being kind of paranoid, and so he grabbed some water and put out the fire, engulfing him in darkness, and then he climbed into his tent and fell asleep. The next morning, Volcanic got up at sunrise, packed up his tent and his camping gear, and then hiked all day long. And he did this day in and day out, dragging his left foot behind him for over a month. Volcanic knew he was moving much slower than a younger, healthier man would. Some days, he could barely travel a mile before feeling so exhausted that he would have to stop. But despite becoming skinnier and more ragged by the day, Volcanic kept on hiking. And eventually, after going all the way down the Pit River and crossing through the mountains, he finally arrived at the shore of Stave Lake, the same place he'd been when he'd had to amputate his own toes. But this time, he was able to keep on going. Volcanic hiked all the way to the opposite side of Stave Lake, and he came to a stop to take in the view. Surrounding the lake were all these huge rolling mountains, and in one spot, Volcanic noticed the mountains dipped down and formed a natural bowl in the earth that was filled with this gorgeous bluish-white ice. Now, even though Volcanic had never been to this place before, he knew instinctively that that had to be Stave Glacier. And this glacier meant everything to Volcanic because it was the last major landmark on his map on the way to this mine. According to his map, the entrance to the gold mine was located on the side of a mountain not far from the glacier. Now, Volcanic wanted to keep pushing forward and try to get to this entrance as soon as possible. I mean, he was excited. But the sun was starting to go down, and he knew if he kept on going at night, the risk of injury was quite high. He could slip and fall. And remember, it had taken Volcanic over a month to hike into this location. He is way away from civilization, and so if he gets hurt, nobody's coming to help him. And so he decided he would stop and make camp that night. He pitched his tent well away from the tree line, he ate some beef jerky and biscuits, and then he crawled into his sleeping bag to try to go to sleep. But he couldn't. He was too excited about this mine. He was so close. And so he laid there restlessly for hours, listening to the sound of the wind pick up outside. Now, normally the sound of the wind would help Volcanic fall asleep. But tonight, it was not helping. It was actually making him feel really uneasy. The wind was loud and fast, howling across the lake. And that's when Volcanic noticed that despite all the noise outside, when he looked at the fabric of his tent, it wasn't moving with the wind. It was totally stationary. And so Volcanic sat up and he opened up the flap of his tent and looked outside. And the second he did, it got even louder, the howling wind. But he couldn't feel any wind blowing. And so he struck a match and he held it out in front of his tent, and the flame didn't even flicker, again, despite all this crazy howling sounds. And that's when he realized there was no wind. And so feeling totally unsettled, Volcanic closed the flap of his tent, got back in his sleeping bag, clutching his gun, listening to this horrifying sound outside that he couldn't make any sense of. And then by the morning, when the sun came up, the sound just went away. By this point, Volcanic was so anxious just to leave and go to this mine that he didn't eat any breakfast. He just grabbed his journal, tore the map out of the last page, tucked it in his back pocket, and he started hiking. He still felt very uneasy about the phantom wind he had heard all night long, but now his sole focus was on this mine. He knew that if he could find it, he would not only have infinite riches, but he would also go down in history as like the greatest gold prospector ever. And on top of that, on the way back out again, he could stop at that supply store and drop some gold on the counter and rub it in that clerk's face, just like he said he would. Volcanic made his way first towards the glacier and then up the side of a mountain. He dodged tree limbs and climbed over boulders, all the while dragging his left foot on the ground. And then finally, up ahead, he saw this dark hole on the side of a mountain, and it looked like the entrance to a cave. Now, Volcanic could not see very far into that cave, but he was certain the gold mine had to be inside of there. And so with a rush of excitement, he made his way up to the dark entryway, and he stepped inside. 2 months later, on November 2nd, 1931, that store clerk back in Alvin looked out the front window of his store and watched the snow begin to fall. A blizzard was coming in, and all this clerk could think about was that strange old man with the gold teeth who had wandered off into the wilderness 3 months earlier. Now, the old man had told the clerk that he would stop by the store on his way out to prove he had found the gold. However, the man had not returned. And so the clerk wasn't sure if that was because, he was too embarrassed because he hadn't found the mine, or if maybe he had gotten stuck out in the wilderness. But either way, the clerk just had a bad feeling that, something bad could have happened to that guy. And so just to play it safe, the clerk grabbed his jacket, he left the store, and he went to go find the local game warden to tell him what was going on. 3 weeks later, that same game warden trudged through knee-high snow at the edge of Stave Lake. Even though he and his search party were much younger and healthier than Volcanic, it had still taken them weeks to arrive here, mostly because of the blizzard. But in all the time it took hiking to this location, they had not found a single trace of Volcanic. The warden was beginning to wonder if this was pointless, if they should just turn around and head back. And that's when he looked up and he noticed the glacier on the far end of the lake. And in the snow near that glacier was this little pop of color. The warden pointed it out to his men, and they all began running towards it. And as they got closer, they realized what this thing was a tent that had collapsed under the snow. And then once they actually reached the tent, they shoveled off all the snow and sort of popped it back up, and they looked inside. But Volcanic was not in there. Instead, they found an empty sleeping bag, they found some cooking supplies, a shotgun, some ammo, and a journal that's last page was missing. But there was also one more thing that was inside of this tent. On the floor, right near the opening flap of this tent, was a glass jar. The warden picked it up, and he looked inside, and he gasped. Volcanic Brown was never seen again, and no explanation for what happened to him was ever uncovered. His body was never found, and there were no signs of struggle anywhere in or near his campsite. But the contents of that glass jar that was found inside of the tent proved that either Slumac's gold mine or Slumac's curse was real. There are two slightly different versions of what people believe was found inside of that jar. The first is that the jar was filled with huge nuggets of raw gold. If this is true, it means the gold mine did exist, and Volcanic must have found it before he disappeared. But the second version of what people say was found in that jar has a much darker meaning. In that version, when the warden held up that jar, he did see gold inside, but it was not gold from the mine. Instead, it was Volcanic's solid gold teeth. Almost 100 years have passed since Volcanic went missing, and still to this day, no one has ever successfully found the mine and lived to tell the tale. But to this day, people still keep looking for it, and so far, at least 33 people have either died or disappeared in search of it. One night in the summer of 1921, a young man named Carl Logies walked across the farm that he had recently purchased in rural Ohio. He was on his way to check on his horses and his cattle one last time before he went to bed. He had a gun on his hip and a lantern in the other hand, and as he walked across the farm, he sort of looked out at the farmhouse and the barn up ahead and the water well and all this land, and he couldn't help but feel really proud of what he had. I mean, this was all his. So Carl had always dreamed of having this, of having his own farm, and he'd been able to get this one for a really low price because apparently the people who owned it before him had been very eager to get rid of it, and he had seen it as a great opportunity. Now, Carl didn't really know why they wanted to move it so badly, but he didn't care. It just meant he got a great deal. And so Carl continued walking over to the barn where his cattle and his horses were, and as he got closer, keep in mind it's dark out, it's late at night, he suddenly felt the hairs in the back of his neck stand up, and he had this unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. But Carl, he lives alone. It's just him and his animals. Like, there's no reason there would be anybody nearby to watch him. And so instinctively, Carl stops where he is and he whips around and he shines his lantern in all directions, just seeing if there's somebody there, but there's nobody. Granted, his field of vision is pretty limited. I mean, it's dark outside, his lantern's not that bright, but for the most part, he can tell that there's no one in the immediate vicinity. He's all alone. And so then his thought is, well, is there a predator nearby? I mean, is there an animal watching me? But Carl, he's looking around and it's a peaceful, quiet night, and the previous owners certainly hadn't mentioned any risk of predators in the area. And so Carl tells himself, he's just being paranoid. He's new to this property. He doesn't really know what it's like to be here. And so he tells himself, you're just overthinking it. Go to the barn, take care of your animals, and just go to bed. Everything is fine. And so Carl turns around and he walks over to the barn. He goes inside and he kind of busies himself getting the horses and the cattle ready for the night. And, he's in there for a few minutes. And for the most part, he's forgotten about that strange feeling he had when he came over, that feeling of being watched. But after he was wrapping up, he couldn't help but start to feel like he had that feeling again, that there was somebody watching him. And so he's looking out his barn door and he doesn't see anything, but it's dark out there and he's kind of looking around the inside of his barn. And again, he's telling himself that you're being paranoid, everything is fine. But admittedly, deep down, Carl was feeling pretty nervous about just this walk he was going to have to make through the darkness across his property back over to the farmhouse. But, he steeled his resolve. He grabbed his lantern and he checked his gun on his hip. And then he walked out the doors of his barn and began quickly making his way towards his house. And as he's walking, he's kind of scanning both sides, checking to make sure nobody's out here, and he's not seeing anyone. And right as he's about halfway to his house, something catches his eye on the far side of the property, something kind of off in the distance. And he stops and he aims his lantern in that direction, which doesn't really illuminate that much, but it illuminates enough to see that there's actually somebody standing on his property. And he's so alarmed by it, he just stands there holding his lantern, looking at this person, and it's like this white silhouette just standing there still, looking right over at Carl. They're sort of in the vicinity of his water well. And after being frozen for a second, Carl kind of snapped out of it and he said, "Hey, who are you? What are you doing here?" And this figure doesn't move, doesn't react. They just stand there kind of staring at Carl, and then they turn and begin kind of moving away from Carl in the direction of the water well. And Carl, at this point, he doesn't know what's happening. He thinks that this person clearly is some sort of trespasser. They must have been here earlier. Like, that's what I was feeling. They were here. They've been watching me. Are they gonna try to rob me? Like, who is this? And so he draws his gun and he starts chasing after this person. And as he's running, his lantern's waving back and forth. And like, as he's running, he loses sight of this white figure. And by the time he actually gets to the water well, he realizes he's lost this person. They're just gone. At this point, Carl really didn't know what to make of this. He didn't know where this person went. Like, he has no idea if they've doubled back around and they're gonna try to go in his house at some point here. He does not understand what's happened or where they've gone. He doesn't know who they are. And so all he can think to do as he's standing there by the well, out of breath, from running there, is just to yell out that, he's got a gun and he's not afraid to use it and don't you dare come back here. But despite yelling out these sort of open-ended threats into the darkness, there's no response. And he doesn't see this white figure anywhere. It's just dark and silent in all directions. And so for a while, Carl just stood there at the well, just, looking out, almost expecting to see this figure reappear, but they never did. And eventually, when it really felt like everything had kind of calmed down on his property, he just turned and run the rest of the way over to his farmhouse. He went inside and locked the door behind him. Now, the next morning when Carl woke up, he tried to tell himself that whatever happened the night before, it had to be an anomaly. Like, maybe that was a neighbor who had come over and they were shy, or maybe it was, a potential trespasser or a thief or something, and they were scared off by Carl's threats of being willing to use his weapon. Like, Carl is telling himself that whatever that was last night, he likely would never encounter that person ever again, and it was handled. But Carl was wrong. Almost every single night from that night onward for the next year, at about 9:30 p.m. every night, around the time that Carl would go to the barn to check on his animals before bed, he would always see that figure. And they were never close enough that Carl could actually see who it was or get any sense of what they wanted. They were always just kind of off on the side of the property, always watching Carl every time he came out of the barn. And then when he would invariably scream at them and run towards them, and even at one point he fired his weapon in their direction, every time this figure would just, without saying anything, move away from Carl in the direction of the water well. And around there, Carl would lose sight of them. They would just vanish. Now, as much as Carl really wanted to pretend that this was just something explainable, that this was some person coming on his property that was evading his capture every single night, as much as he wished that could be the explanation, Carl knew, despite not being a very superstitious or, a believer in the paranormal, despite not being those things, he felt like what he was witnessing was a ghost. I mean, what else could it be? It's this white figure that floats away from him and vanishes every night. Like, that's a ghost. And also, another part of Carl was thinking, like, the previous owners were really excited to sell this property effectively at a loss. It's like they just wanted to be rid of this property. And he couldn't help but feel like, maybe there's a connection between what I'm seeing and why they left. But the one thing that Carl hung on to was that despite how unsettling this whole thing was and how terrifying it was to, see this figure floating around on his property, despite that, the reality is it was pretty predictable. Every night around 9:30, he would see this ghost, whatever it was, but it didn't really affect him or his animals. It was just terrifying. And he accepted that. It just sort of became his new normal. That is, until August 1st of 1922, which happened to be almost exactly a year after Carl had purchased this property. On that day, Carl noticed his horses, his cattle, they stopped drinking the water, the well water that he gave them all year long since he had been here. They had never had any issues with it, but on that day, they just stopped drinking it. And in fact, they were kind of skittish around the water, like there was something in the water that was upsetting them. Carl tasted the water, it tasted fine to him, but he assumed there just must be something in it that made it unclean to the animals. And so what he had to do was clean the water, which meant he needed to drain the well, get rid of all this dirty water, and let the well refill, and hopefully at that point it will be clean. So Carl goes over to the water well. Remember, this is always where the figure goes off and disappears to. And as the water began to drain, he realized there was something in the well, clearly deep in the well that he never would have been able to see unless he drained it. And here he is draining it, and he's looking down and he can't quite tell what it is, but eventually the water was shallow enough that it was obvious what was in the bottom of his well. And at that point, he went and got the sheriff. It would turn out 5 years earlier, Carl's farm had been owned by another man whose name was Frank Lerman. And Frank, when he was here, had multiple employees. including a young farmhand named Henry Lipenstick. And one day, Henry had gone missing. Henry didn't have any family or close friends who lived nearby, and so basically everybody in town assumed that Henry must have just left town. But one of Frank's neighbors had told the sheriff at the time that she didn't actually believe that. She thought maybe Frank himself had done something to Henry. Because according to her, Frank and Henry argued all the time about money. Like there was clearly real tension between those two. The sheriff tried to look into Frank to see if there was any legitimacy to this claim. But at the same time this investigation was beginning, Frank abruptly sold his property and moved away. And without any real evidence, the sheriff couldn't prove there was any foul play involved. And so he just had to close the case and move on. Until Carl, 5 years later, drained that well. And suddenly, the Henry Lipenstick case was solved. Because at the bottom of the well, Carl found Henry's very decomposed body. He was practically skeletal by this point, but they could tell that was Henry. An autopsy later revealed that Henry had died of blunt force trauma to the head, and his death was ruled a homicide. Frank was arrested and found guilty of second-degree murder, but he only served 7 months before his charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence, and he was released. When they pulled Henry's remains out of the well to give him a proper burial, they noticed he was wearing a watch, and the watch had stopped at 9:35 p.m., precisely the time that Carl, for a whole year, saw that white figure running off, disappearing over towards the water well where Henry's body was located. After Henry's body was properly buried, Carl never saw that white figure ever again. Also, it's believed that the previous owners right before Carl, who sold him the property at a discount, likely they were selling it because they too had seen Henry's ghost. Happy New Year, everybody! And to celebrate this new year, I actually have a pretty huge announcement. So beginning this Monday and going forward, we're going old school on this channel. We're going back to 2, 3, even 4 uploads a week. And this is none of that oh, we edited it differently so it's brand new. No, we're talking new content up to 4 times a week. So how will it actually work? Well, this week, you're gonna be getting new stories on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and of course Saturday. Saturday is the same as it's always been and will continue to be. And then each and every week after that, you're gonna be getting 2, 3, even 4 brand new Mrballen episodes every single week. You've told me that you want more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and now you're gonna get it. Can't wait to see you guys. Thank you. Late one night in the winter of 1933, a young nobleman named Anton Holberg poured another round of drinks for all of his buddies who were sitting inside of one of Anton's many sitting rooms inside of his huge castle that he owned in southern Poland. And after pouring these drinks, Anton kind of clumsily began walking his way over to the table where his buddies were, and because Anton was pretty drunk, because he and his friends had been drinking for hours and playing cards and partying, Anton stumbled at some point and basically spilled half of the drinks onto the carpet. But because he was so drunk, he just thought it was really funny, and so did his friends. They were all roaring with laughter as he's on the carpet, picking up all these basically empty glasses. But then instead of going back and re-pouring the drinks, Anton, sort of as a joke, walked over to the table, sat down, and handed out these basically empty cups to his friends. And everybody thought it was so funny, and they didn't even get up to get more drinks. They were just all so drunk and happy, they just kept on playing their card game. And so as Anton's sitting there and everyone's laughing and smiling, the friend of his that was the dealer for this round of blackjack began to deal. But as he did, there was this sudden, really loud creaking sound that came from right above them. And it was so loud and so pronounced that even amongst this loud room of drunk men playing cards, everybody heard it. And there was a moment of silence where everyone sort of registered, like, what's going on above us? And in this sudden stillness, Anton, he sort of made a jest and he goes, oh boy, that's the monk. Now, for the most part, everybody at the table, all of Anton's friends that were there, they had heard the story of the so-called hooded monk that apparently haunted the castle. That's at least what Anton would say. But one person who was there that night was a new friend of Anton's, and they had not heard of, the monk story. And they said, well, what are you talking about? That's the monk. And immediately everyone's like, oh, geez, here we go. Because Anton, he looked over at the friends and he was like, oh, you haven't heard the story of the hooded monk? Let me tell you. And then Anton basically told this friend, as the rest of the friends are all like, give me a break, this is just crap, this is not real. But Anton would tell this person, this newbie, that when he took ownership of this huge castle, he was told that everything's fine, Except there's one bedroom upstairs that's totally off limits because apparently it is haunted by a hooded monk, an evil hooded monk that sort of patrols this room. And Anton told this friend that he actually had never gone in that bedroom because he believed the story was true, that maybe, just maybe, there really was a malevolent spirit, a hooded monk figure that was in there. And also, he had tons of bedrooms in his castle. He didn't need to go in there, but, right above us is that off-limits bedroom. And so maybe that creak we heard was the monk. Now, again, basically everybody in the room knew this story because Anton loved to tell the story of how his castle was haunted. But that's all it ever was. It was just some story that Anton told. But this friend, when they heard this from Anton, their reaction was, wait a minute, you have a bedroom in this castle that you own that you literally haven't gone inside of because there's a ghost in there? Are you kidding me? You literally haven't gone in that room for that reason? And as they said it out loud, all of Anton's other friends sort of picked up on how cowardly it seemed for Anton to have never gone in. Suddenly this story just made it seem like Anton was just kind of a coward. And everybody just piled on. They're like, yeah, Anton, why haven't you gone in there? Come on, man, this is your castle. Go in that bedroom. And before long, Anton was no longer happy to be talking about this story. He was like, oh yeah, just forget about it, guys. Let's get back to our game. But nobody would let it go until finally they dared him hey, not only should you go in there, but tonight, you should stay the night in that bedroom to show us that you're really not afraid. And eventually, because Anton was so drunk and he was sort of standing up for his pride, he finally said, fine, I'll go in there and I'll spend the night. Fine, I'll show you that this is just a story, it's no big deal. Now, after Anton loosely agreed to this, he likely thought that, the guys will forget about this and we'll go back to playing cards, and by the end of the night, nobody's gonna make sure I really go into that bedroom tonight. They're gonna forget about this. But no, the friends would not let this go. And at the end of the night, when they had kind of wound down their card game and everybody was feeling pretty tired, they all were like, okay, Anton, we're gonna walk you up to your bedroom to make sure you sleep inside of that haunted room. And because Anton had already publicly declared that he wasn't afraid and he would do it, he was like, okay, let's go. And so the group, with Anton in the lead, they left the sitting room and they went up the stairs to the second floor, and they go down the hallway to the bedroom where supposedly, this hooded monk ghost resided. And the door, it wasn't barred up or anything, but again, Anton had never been in there, but he had grabbed the key. And Anton, he goes up and he sort of nervously unlocks the door, and then before pushing it open, he turns and looks at his friends and he's like, all right, I'm going in, trying to see if they really wanted him to do it. And all his friends are sort of looking at him sort of hesitantly, but they're like, yeah, go inside, go, do it. And Anton's like, all right. And he pushes the door open, and he and his friends, they all look inside. For the first time, Anton is now laying eyes on the inside of this bedroom. And really, there was not much to see. It was a bedroom, and there was old furniture in there that looked like it had been there for hundreds of years, covered in dust, and there's cobwebs everywhere, but it basically just looked like a really old bedroom that nobody used. And so his friends are like, all right, Anton, get in there. And Anton's like, all right, I'll see you in the morning. And he goes inside the room and he shuts the door. And then the friends, they all walked back down the hall, went into their respective bedrooms where they were sleeping, and everybody went to bed. Several hours later, in the middle of the night, as all the friends are all asleep, there's this sudden, extremely loud, blood-curdling scream that appeared to be coming from the bedroom where Anton was, inside the haunted room. And so the friends, they jump out of bed, they run into the hallway, they go down the hall, and they get to the door and they try to open it, the room that Anton's in, but it's locked. And they start banging on the door, yelling, Anton, are you okay? Are you okay? Because even though they had put him up to this, they had dared him to do this, they didn't really think there was any risk, but at the same time, maybe there was something bad in there, so they're worried. They're worried about Anton. They want to make sure he's okay. But after pounding and yelling on the door, there was no response. The haunted bedroom where Anton was completely silent. And the friends, they all kind of exchanged worried glances, and they're like, we got to get in there. We got to make sure he's okay. Something just feels wrong. That scream, that's somebody in danger. Anton could be hurt here. And so they began smashing this door, ramming into it, until finally they literally blew the door off its hinges. And when they looked into the room and saw what was going on, they couldn't believe it. When Anton went into the bedroom to spend the night, his friends would recall hearing the sound of him turning the key and locking the bedroom door behind him. So Anton is in this haunted bedroom and he's locked inside, and there's no other way in or out of this bedroom. So he is in there totally alone and he's locked the door. So keep that in mind. So now, a few hours later, after hearing the scream, the friends blow the door open, literally knock it off its hinges because it was locked, and they find Anton. and he's dead. And he's laying on the bed on his back, and the only sign of something that happened to him is there's this red mark around his neck, like a ligature mark, a thin red ligature mark around his neck. But there's no rope or line anywhere in the room. There's no sign of a struggle. There's nothing else really in this room except for Anton. And he's just inexplicably dead with this mark on his neck. Authorities got involved and they searched the room top to bottom, and they never found any rope or any line, nothing that could have left those marks on his neck. And they also did an autopsy on Anton, but they couldn't figure out what his cause of death was. So just the fact that Anton died in this really inexplicable way in a bedroom that he claimed was haunted is pretty mysterious. But it becomes even more mysterious when you consider the whole story about this ghost that haunted this castle. So Anton, when he would typically tell the story, would just basically say, well, there's this evil hooded monk that is upstairs in one of the bedrooms, and that's why I don't go in it. And that's kind of the whole story. But that's not the whole story. That's just kind of the version that Anton would tell. The whole story was, this castle has been haunted for hundreds of years. There is an evil monk that lives in that bedroom upstairs, and if you go in there, the evil monk will kill you by strangling you with a thin rope. That's the story. And so it really makes you wonder, because to this day, nobody knows how Anton Holberg died alone in that locked bedroom after seemingly being strangled by a rope that didn't exist. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, January 20th, 1907, a 57-year-old man named Samuel Hughes was riding on a passenger train that was moving through southeastern Wales. Sam had spent basically the last 24 hours working the entire time. He was a salt merchant, and he had left the town where he lived, a town called Blackwood, and taken a train south about an hour to another town called Newport, where he did a lot of business. And basically all day Saturday, from early morning all the way until late at night, he had been working. And now finally, 1 a.m. on Sunday, he's back on a train heading back to his town in Blackwood. But despite how utterly exhausted he was on this ride back home, barely able to keep his eyes open, Sam was just so relieved that soon, very soon, he would get off the train, he'd be back in his house, and he could just collapse in bed. And so that's all he's thinking about. And so for a little bit longer, Sam is, fighting to keep his eyes open, and the train's rumbling along, and he can tell he's getting close to home. I mean, he rides this train all the time. This is a pretty, regular route for him. And then finally, Sam feels the train start to slow down, at which point he gathers up all his things. He gets up and kind of shuffles his way into the hall. And then once the train came to a full stop, he stepped off the train onto the platform, relieved that, he's now maybe 10 minutes from home. But as the train took off from the station, Sam, who's again standing on this platform, it's late at night here, he's looking around and he realizes something. In his stupor, in his exhaustion, he didn't realize this was not his stop. He had gotten off one stop too early. It was like he was on autopilot. He was so tired, he got off thinking he was home, but he wasn't. And now the train is gone. And remember, this is the early 1900s. He didn't have a quick way to get from where he was to his home. Like, there wasn't going to be another train anytime soon, nor did he know the train schedule. He also didn't have a way to call a cab or anything. It's 1, 2 in the morning here. And so Sam realizes he basically can either find a place to stay in whatever town this is, or he can basically walk to Blackwood, which is, a pretty good walk away, but he figured, maybe, this town was close enough he could do it. And so he figured, his first step here is just leave the platform and just go find somebody, anybody in town that maybe is out and about, and just kind of figure out where we are. How do I get to Blackwood? Is there a hotel nearby or an inn or something? But he needs to go find somebody. And so even though Sam at this point is furious with himself and really just wants to spend time dwelling on the fact that he's made this mistake, he's sort of over that, and he's just focused on finding a solution. And so Sam leaves the platform and he starts walking, in the general direction of lights that he sees off in the distance. But this is a small train platform. He's clearly not near any major city. It's pretty much dark and just rural roads going in different directions. And so he really does not have high hopes that he's gonna run into anybody anytime soon. But surprisingly, after leaving the platform and walking not very far, he got to an intersection where he saw another person walking up the other street. And he quickly quickly realized it was a police officer, and so Sam is like so relieved, an authority figure, they can help me, and he flags down the police officer, and the officer comes over, and they're kind of sizing up Sam, like, what are you doing out here? It's the middle of the night, you got luggage with you, like, what's going on here? And Sam explained the mistake he had made and asked the officer, like, hey, is there a place to stay here? Or maybe, is it walkable to get to my town, Blackwood? And the officer would tell him, like, there is places to stay in this town, but if you're up for it, it would only take you, maybe an hour if you did want to make the walk to Blackwood. And, if I was in your shoes, I might do that. And Sam, he thought about it and he was like, you know what? I do. I just want to get home. I want to get in my own bed. So yes, just point me in the right direction. And so the officer, he explained to Sam that luckily it's really simple. You just basically go straight down that road and you walk for about an hour until you reach a bridge. Once you get over the bridge, follow some signs and it'll be really obvious that you're right near Blackwood and you'll make it the rest of the way. And so Sam thanked the officer and then gathered up his things and he began walking in the direction of his town. Several hours later, a little after 3 a.m., Sam's wife, Bess, was awake inside of their home in Blackwood. She was awake because she was waiting for Sam to get home. She knew he would have a long day in Newport, but by now she knew he should be home. I mean, he went on this trip fairly regularly. She knew how long it took, even on the long end, and it being 3 a.m. and him not being home was starting to be pretty concerning. And so she's up, she's kind of anxious, and all of a sudden, she hears Sam calling out to her. He's clearly out in front of the property. He must have known that she was awake. He could see the lights on inside the house, and he was calling out to her that, he was returning. And so Bess, she's overcome with relief. She knows her husband is safe. She grabs a candle, and she goes to the front door to greet her husband. She opens the door, and she looks out, and it's not her husband. Her husband is nowhere to be found. Instead, there is this dark figure standing on her porch, just inches away, looking right at Bess. And Bess, she freezes when she sees it, but she isn't scared. There's a weird calm about what she's looking at. She doesn't know what it is. She has no idea what to do, but she's just standing there, calm, as this figure is right in front of her, not moving. And as she's just staring at it, she realizes it's dressed in this long black cloak, and it had on a black silk hat. And her husband always wore a black silk hat, and she knew specifically he had worn it that morning when he went to Newport. And so for a minute, she's just staring sort of unbelievably at this apparition, apparently wearing clothes, at least a hat, that belonged to her husband, and she knows she just heard her husband call to her. She didn't imagine that, he just called to her, but then Bess blinked, and the figure just vanished. The hat, the cloak, it's all just gone, and there's nobody standing on her porch. And now Bess is scared, because as much as there was a calm about this figure, now she's thinking, like, did I just imagine that? Like, what's going on here? Is my husband outside somewhere? Did he call to me because he's hurt or something? And so she leaves her house with this candle and she's running around her house calling out for Sam, but Sam's not out there. And so eventually Bess goes back inside the house and just continues to sit up waiting for Sam. But Sam doesn't come home. And eventually, by 5 or 6 in the morning, Bess just goes to bed. When Bess woke up later that afternoon, Sam still had not come home yet. But now, the sun is out and she's telling herself that weird thing that happened last night, she must have imagined that, like that didn't happen. And, Sam's fine, he'll be home. He's stayed late before and not told me, like everything's okay. But as Bess is reassuring herself that everything's okay, she hears a knock on the front door. And for a second, she thinks maybe it's Sam, maybe he's home. But she goes to the door, she opens it up, and it's a police officer. And he just says to her, I have some terrible news. It would turn out the night before, when Sam met that police officer who told him to walk this way to get back to Blackwood, well, Sam had followed the directions, and apparently he was on the right path because he got all the way to that bridge that the officer said would, demarcate that he was close to Blackwood. But perhaps because he was so exhausted, or maybe just because it was still so dark outside, he fell off the bridge to his death. And so the police officer is telling Bess this, and she's totally overcome with grief. But then for whatever reason, her mind immediately went to that dark figure she saw on the porch a little after 3 a.m. And without really thinking this through, she just said to the officer, what time do you think he died? And the officer was like, well, based on the officer that directed Samuel in that direction, towards the bridge and how long it would have taken him to get there, we estimate he likely fell off the bridge around 3 in the morning. And so for Bess, she's thinking, that's around the same time I saw that figure on my porch. And then she also began to think about that hat, the black silk hat that Sam always wore, that she knew he had worn that morning when he went to Newport. And so Bess's next question was, well, when you found him, was he wearing his black silk hat? And the officer was kind of confused and said, no, He wasn't wearing a hat at all. And so when Bess heard that, those details confirmed that who or what she saw on her porch earlier that morning, the dark figure with the black silk hat, that must have been Sam's soul. He was coming to say goodbye to his wife because he had just fallen off the bridge and died. And, this figure having that black silk hat on was a way of showing her that, yes, that really was her husband. Bess would later tell this story to a reporter who would have this story printed all over Wales, and that's how we know it today.